Thank you very much for inviting me. Thanks for the eminent panelists for joining. Thanks to them for joining us. Thanks for arranging for their involvement. Thanks for arranging the event, Pugal Gandhi and Dharanidharan. As always, thought-provoking and enlightening discussions seem to happen every time we have one of these. I hope today will be no exception. Partly because I have a conflict of interest as a sitting finance minister and as the founder of this forum, and partly because I want this to be mostly about ideas rather than politics. I don't want to get too deep into philosophical questions, at least at Tamil Nadu level. So if it's okay with you, what I'd like to do, I certainly don't want to talk for 20 minutes, but I'd just like to pose a few questions that might enlighten the debate or that might kind of guide the comments of the fellow panelists in terms of trying to answer what I see as basic queries that we as a government contemplate. So before we think about, monetization of existing assets, I think a more profound question, especially for someone like our DMK party that has come back into power after 10 years, and finds ourselves with both a greatly constrained balance sheet, a huge debt load and a huge interest load, and inability to do the kind of capital investments we'd like to do. I think the first and profound question to us is, what is really a public good or service? What is something that only the government can and should provide? What is something that the government could provide in competition with others? What is something that is a revenue generating asset, like a lease of a shop in a bus stand? What is something that is clearly got no revenue at all directly and is really a social or a public good, like building toilets in classrooms, toilets and classrooms in schools, in government schools, particularly in girls' schools where they seem to not have enough. And the question that follows from that is, do we see these as products like we used to before, where we buy something and then we operate it? Or do we see these as services where they're permanently leased to somebody and then they just provide kind of ongoing service? So for example, the transport corporations, right now we buy buses and then the government of Tamil Nadu operates them. In a lot of states, they have changed to a model where they buy the provision of bus service, so including the bus, including the driver, including the maintenance, all of that. Certain routes are run at certain frequencies, and that is the provision of the service. In a bit, you can think of this as buying software and maintaining it yourself, or buying software as a service where we just pay an annual fee and we get these kinds of net outcomes, including maintenance and so forth. And based on these, for example, the dilemma we go through is right now, we are constrained, as I say, based on our balance sheet and our financial situation, to spending no more than 40 or 45,000 crores this year in capital investments. That is a very, very low percentage because our revenue deficit is so high. And the correlation between good investments in water systems, in hospitals, in ports, in roads, in colleges, and outcomes in terms of growth rates is fairly well agreed. So if we have a situation where the FRBM Act and the FRA Act of our state recommends about 3%, now 3.5% fiscal deficit, ideally we would like to spend much of that or all of that towards capital investments and use that to generate growth. But because of our fiscal deficit, our revenue deficit, which is already almost 2% of GSDP, we are severely constrained. Now, when that happens, we start asking ourselves, should we really be investing 100% equity in a lot of these projects? Is there, a classification of investments or capital projects where some of these must be and always will be 100% government equity, 100% government control, built by the government or at best by contractors under the management of the government, and delivered, and then we operate these. And then what are assets at the other extreme, like toll roads, like the government of India now does, which are basically built almost entirely by the contractor under the BOT model, or what they call the hybrid asset model, where there's some part of equity from the government, a lot of equity from the investor, who's also the developer, and then the revenues are shared at a certain ratio for a certain number of years, and after that they revert to the state. So, is that an option? And there's also the additional issue where we have things like public goods and services which are really struggling. So, for example, electricity in Tamil Nadu, we have a Tamil Nadu electricity board that has a debt of about 1.71 lakh crores between the labor costs and the sourcing costs and all of the kind of inputs. The unit cost of acquisition for our Tangetco is about 9 rupees and something paise a unit. On average, on the retail, we sell for 2 rupees something. We sell a bit higher on the industrial. You do all of the average, weighted average across all the consumers, and at best we realize something like 7 rupees a unit. So we're running about 2.5 rupees a unit for crores and crores or hundreds of crores of units. And Tangetco is therefore operating at about 35,000 crore a year loss. Now, there are multiple ways we could see a resolution to this problem, but one that has been suggested to us is the model that has been adopted in places like Delhi or Orissa, where they have effectively outsourced the entire model, including the staff that were operating under the electricity departments. I'm not saying we're going to touch it anytime soon. I'm just saying those are the models that other states have adopted, and they seem to be at least at a lower loss or lower subsidy, if not, as I'm told in the case of Delhi, an outright positive dividend paid to the government of Delhi, the state of Delhi, from the contractor. So, we are thinking much more prospectively rather than retrospectively in terms of existing assets to monetize. Now, there's also the moral question when you're trying to monetize existing assets, particularly if you're, a party that has relatively recently come to government, and in the scope of the 75 or 80 years of, independent country, you have not had a whole lot of hand in the development of these assets. Then for you to end up coming and monetizing these assets that were built under the administration and the foresight of other people is an issue. And I'll leave you with just one last issue, which is the technical issue. As a former market participant and employee of large banks for multiple years in multiple continents, is a pipeline where you designate, lakhs and lakhs of crores of assets, trillions of rupees of assets over a 3-year horizon, and a stated intent that you need to raise that much as part of your budgeting process and your entire financial model. Is that really the best way to monetize assets? Or are you better off being kind of, asset by asset, situation by situation, bidder by bidder, and type of investor by type of investor, monetizing these assets? So, I'm not sure that any of these grand big number plans have ever worked, at least in the last 6-7 years. We keep hearing about this number of 100 lakh crores of capital investment. I'm yet to see much of that. And then we wonder about the dichotomy that on the one hand, we talk about 100 lakh crores of capital investment from the government. On the other hand, we talk about monetizing the assets built over the decades that previous governments maybe had built. And so, it's a complex issue as we see it, at least. There are a whole number of aspects to this. I'll just maybe give one last example. Part of it also is that the technology and the models change so rapidly, and the environment in terms of the migration of people, the needs of people, the situations. So in water, for example, we have the 2 examples in Tamil Nadu. One, in Madurai, the city I come from and where I'm an MLA, we have been continuously claiming to develop an integrated underground drainage system. But every time some part opens up, it's taken so long that by the time it opens, it gets clogged because the headcount and the demand has gone up so high. that we have not planned far enough ahead or executed fast enough. And so the system seems inadequate and we have to do this again. And at the administrative level, for example, we issued a white paper this year, earlier in August, and we have an entity called the TWAD, Tamil Nadu Water Administration Department. And the TWAD right now has about 1,400 or 1,500 employees and about 9,000 something pensioners in a clearly, unsustainable financial model based on track record from previous years. And so we're going to have to do some kind of one-time restructuring if that board is going to continue to be viable and then provide a public service and water delivery. So I think these are the things we think about. In terms of retrospective monetization, we have clearly indicated that we are not very enthusiastic about it. We certainly don't feel a great urgency or a great affinity for monetizing things like Chennai Airport, which were on the list cited by the Union government. The Chief Minister has written to the Union government stating our opposition to such moves. I was very happy to hear. I think a lot of good points were made. And I think the ideal situation, of course, is something you talked about, which is to move these out of the control of the bureaucrats and the executive to the legislature. Because if I was to talk the other side of this problem that I see, I completely agree with you that political interference in PSUs has been one of the biggest causes of the decay or the lack of good performance. I also feel that the alignment of politics has reached into the government unions, and you find that politics plays a role even there in terms of rather than for the workers, they're talking more about the parties. Also, when we try to price things for the public, for example, in Tamil Nadu, a lot of the benefits of the pricing go to the upper crust and not to the real common people. So though we give, for example, the first 100 units of electricity free, when we actually go and see where the subsidy in electricity is going, the greatest portion of the subsidy in electricity is going to people who use more than 500 units, in fact, who use more than 1,000 units because of the way this is structured. So there's not enough progressivity in the way things are done. Is this systemic or is this an aberration? It's hard for me to say. And I think right now, for example, we have a dilemma where we have a bus stand that was built 100% on government funds, but it had some problems, corruption, so forth, which I've already listed while I was an opposition member. But now we have a situation where there are about 200 or 300 shops to be leased. Now, in normal circumstances, these kinds of leases, would also have corruption in them. But for example, we have just run a lease for a replacement of some shops around the temple, where the monthly rent income has gone up almost 10x because the auctions were run transparently. And since it was in my constituency and I'm the minister, I made sure there was no political interference. And so the fair auction yielded to the people 10x the monthly rent that we were getting in the old setup. So I think it's as much about execution as it is about philosophy or politics. Any model can be ruined by bad execution. Even a bad model can be leavened by good execution. And in the case of legislatures, I think there's a broader problem here. As I said when I was an opposition member, and I repeat when I'm a minister, that in many cases, the whole the power of the legislature as envisioned in the Constitution already seems to have eroded greatly. And because of the partisanship that has developed and the anti-defection law and various activities, various shifts in the model, we are now in a situation where the legislature is mostly voiceless and just used as a rubber stamp. So I think there are some underlying problems. But certainly it was very thought-provoking, and I was taking notes copiously while you were speaking. I think some of these will certainly inform our, internal discussions and our approach over time. So I just want to express my thanks to both of you for your insightful comments and for your taking the time and addressing the forum. Thank you.